Good morning, I'm Matt Driskill, editor of Asian Aviation Magazine and AsianAviation.com. Welcome to the latest in Conversation. We're now sponsored by Metrojet of Hong Kong. Today we're speaking with Erik Kriel. He's the Aviation Director, Planning and Strategy at Aurecon. Erik, welcome to In Conversation. Thanks for joining me.
Good morning, Matt. It's very nice to be here, and thanks for having us.
First, tell me a little bit about the company. I really, until we got in contact and all of that, I really didn't know that much about the company. Basically, engineering, design company. Can you give us a brief history of the firm and what it specializes in?
Well, Aurecon is a partnership formed by three companies, two from Australia and originally also from South Africa. And they've got a 40-year presence in Asia already. As a consequence of that, goes back quite a while. It's an engineering, design, and advisory business. So we really take quite significant pride in our advisory capabilities. So our mantra is engineering reimagined. So it's unlike the traditional engineering companies where we offer that as well. Really take great pride in innovation as well. Last year, the Australian Financial Review awarded us to be the most innovative company, as well as the most innovative professional services company. So really that's evidence of what we're trying to achieve. Right now, from an aviation perspective, we're working on some of the largest projects in the region: greenfield airport design, greenfield construction. And we're pretty neat and proud of the fact that our aviation team is drawn from both technical and non-technical fields. We've got people that's worked on the airport operator side, which is a pretty good feature of where we're coming from.
Well, does the firm, you do other things besides aviation, right?
Absolutely,
Okay.
Absolutely. So we multidisciplinary engineering. So any engineering discipline you can think of, we cover.
Right.
So it's really the traditional civil engineering where it all started, but I've branched off into so many other regions and aspects of engineering.
Right. Now, the company, I think maybe you were one of the authors, I'm not sure, correct me if I'm wrong, but you authored a paper about Asia's airports dealing with the world post-COVID-19. We still haven't really reached the post-COVID era yet, although especially with all the variants popping up, it seems like it's going to be a while before we can call it that. The passenger experience is already changing. My wife just flew to France over Christmas. Had to get tested here in Singapore before she left. Got tested when she arrived. Got tested when she was coming back. 14 days of quarantine. All of those things. So my question is, airports were not really designed to take things like social distancing into consideration. I mean, they were designed to process as many people as possible from check-in to the gate to the plane. Give us an idea of what's in store for airports as they currently exist, and what about future designs?
Well, when we wrote our thought piece in our paper last year and follow-up pieces that we've been doing, certainly we don't define post-COVID as post-vaccine. So certainly I agree with you. If we were to use that definition, it would be many years before we can say that it's post-COVID. So our perspective on that is that it's really post-outbreak. So the post-COVID world started when all of this hit us. To me, the best analogy that we've been using in our engagements with clients and people like yourself is to use the 9/11 events that went down. So it hit aviation really, really hard. But they went on a sort of a phased recovery out of that. And some of the things that we're experiencing right now is, sort of the second and third step along that journey. But it's not a complete journey, So there are many things still to happen. And that's a view that's also echoed by International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO. That we'll step out of this. It won't be a switch that we flick, as it were. Like your wife, definitely PAC's experience, definitely already changing quite significantly. The thing that we've observed that it's not consistent. There's not a consistent global experience. So there's quite a range in terms of how airports, countries, airlines deal with it and how they respond. It ranges from the highly orchestrated to sometimes slightly on the improvised side. There's still room for standardization and improvement. So despite the best efforts of Airports Council International, ACI or ICAO, Civil Aviation Organization, and IATA, the global standard of how to make it easier for your wife is still, to fully emerge, and more importantly than just emerging, to be adopted consistently. And that's a big challenge. So that leads to a lot of inefficiency and trial and error still. We've read some quite harrowing stories of the European summer last year, where they had inconsistency between different countries and caused a lot of confusion, pain, and such like. So to get to your question, we sort of see those three themes in future design focus for airports. The systems and processes is already the basics, the foundations of those essential changes that we need to make to keep the passengers and don't forget the staff, keep them safe. If we talk about passenger facilitation, we talk about standardizing processes, making those processes familiar, that people know what to expect, and repeatable. Repeatable meaning that we can roll those things out across many airports or many airlines. The analogy we've been using there is the one of airfield signage. So if you, as a pilot, fly across the world, it doesn't matter which airport or city you land on, the runway signage is exactly the same. And there's very good cause and reason for that. It's familiarity, repeatability, and ultimately with the objective that you reduce confusion and you create safety. So I think the same analogy will probably go down in how we deal with biosecurity. If we manage as a global community to standardize that, we can achieve those sorts of outcomes.
Well, it's very interesting. You're not the first one to talk about the analogy of 9/11, and also after post 9/11, there was a lot of inconsistency in the security measures from one area. I mean, in the U.S., you had to take off your shoes. In Asia, you didn't.
Correct.
And all of that. So it's trying to get everybody on the same page, which seems. I've been listening to the speeches from IATA, from AAPA, from ICAO, from ACI World, and all of that. And the one question I have for them is, where is the single voice that's speaking for the industry to try to make these things happen?
And it's a challenge. ICAO is probably the closest in the sense of them representing all airport interests across the world. But we should not forget that they are sort of a country-based organization. So they make effect if countries are signing up for certain international treaties and certain international protocols. So which makes it hard. That's a very slow process by definition, and it often deals with other things adjacent to that, like politics and things like that. So probably the next best port of call is IATA and ACI, and they've been very, very active and very supportive of industry and trying to achieve these outcomes of standardization and things that different countries and different airlines, can jointly adopt. I see a significant opportunity for them, the airports and airlines, therefore ACI and IATA getting together, and they are getting together in terms of facilitating contactless processing, for example. So that was something that we spotted. It was something that started way before COVID, and it's got a significant impetus now, an acceleration. There's another motivation to do these things apart from the good ones of efficiency and effectiveness that was, part of the landscape even before COVID. So that's quite a big part of where we think that things might be going.
So you see that accelerating, the contactless, the biometrics, all of that?
Yes, it has to. It touches on sort of two things there. The one is the safe and efficient exchange of information, which is quite important. That's the digitalization aspect of contactless travel. And the other one is the pure health thing. You quite literally don't have to touch things, and therefore you reduce the risk of infection and transmission and such like through the airport. So it doesn't have to start with full-on high-tech type of contactless and digital processes. It can start with basic housekeeping. I'm talking about the contactless experience. So basic sanitization standards and cleaning things, and ICAO has got fantastic material that they've put out for airlines and airports to use that. But this is probably talking about using that as an impetus or a stepping stone towards a more digital approach to all of these things. I also see part of that to be a big part of the third leg of your question, actually, is to make sure we use these devices and technologies to drive up a better comfort for the passenger, as a human behavioral side. Because if airports are not consistent or if it's complicated, we're going to generate negative airport experiences for the passengers, and that in itself may lead to a slower return to travel, once certain metrics and conditions are met. And clearly, as an industry, we don't want that. We want people to feel comfortable and know what to expect and things like that. So we, for example, we've used one of our user-centered design teams within Aurecon to do some surveys with our own staff, because we wanted to take their pulse on how they might feel about these things. And the indicative findings, which we're still finalizing, is actually echoing exactly what IATA found last year, and that is that people are willing and ready to come back. They're not that afraid. They just need that comfort that there's standardization and familiarity. They know what to expect, type of thing. So that's a key part, we feel, of the recovery process.
Well, I want to go back to one of the things we talked about, which is sort of the politics of all of this, of the different organizations and everything. But I also want to bring up literally the million-dollar question. Who's going to pay for all these changes when we talk about airports accelerating the rollout of technology and contactless travel, airlines, additional sanitation measures and those kinds of things, testing. We have things like the Common Pass or the IATA Travel Pass. Again, more technology, and there may be some fees in there that will have to be accounted for because of the processing and all of those kinds of things. I honestly, it's airlines have already lost, tens of billions of dollars, airports as well. Governments have been deficit spending their way out of this with support packages, some governments. Who's going to pay for the technology? Who's going to pay for the changes that passengers will see? Is it going to be, are we going to see increased user fees? Is there going to be a surcharge on ticket prices to pay for these kinds of adjustments?
Well, I think regrettably, the funding model across aviation is quite divergent across where you are and where you sit in the region or different regions. And that's, of course, based on the funding model that airports may have, the economic ownership, the economic model, the ownership model, and other models. I can give you some examples. If you go to Indonesia, you sit with two big government-backed airport organizations, AP1 and AP2. They semi-commercialized, but there's still a significant government funding and ownership there. If you go to Australia, you find that many of the airports, the big ones, top 20 or so, are privatized and fully commercialized, and they will be looked at to recover most of these costs themselves through commercial means and airline tariff discussions and such like. So it's just the funding model that is significantly different across the region, may have significantly different answers to your question of how it gets funded. But there are many ways in which we've seen it take place already. I know Thailand, airports of Thailand recently, and they're certainly not the only, it's just one example, have started giving some of their tenants rent relief, for example. That we've also observed in other parts of Australia, for example. You have also observed the other extreme where governments, like you've said, would provide direct aid. In Australia, there's a quite big package to stimulate and keep the integrity of the regional aviation network there. Those airports probably would not have been able to stand on the commercial own legs even before COVID, so it's more of a social or a national type of interest, as opposed to the big ones that's supposedly meant to take care of this on their own commercial terms. I think it's important to point out, though, that we're not talking about a massive expenditure. So in other words, people were going to go down these digital and new technology routes in any event, and they were going to go for this expenditure in any event to achieve efficiencies and better passenger outcomes. So we are not of the view that it needs to be overly complicated and therefore a huge quantum of expenditure. There's most likely, and that's also what we echoed in our paper, most likely the control of the health situation sits upstream. It's an administrative type of control. Fly because you've got the right paperwork and proof of your vaccination and things like that, as opposed to full-on testing facilities and all kinds of other things to be facilitated at airport level. And the other thing is, of course, it's sort of a perverse benefit, is that airports have a lot of capacity headroom at the moment. So it's easier for them to achieve some of the outcomes. Not all of them, but some of them. Like social distancing is easier to achieve if you've got space, for example. So the biggest fear I've got for industry is to overreact and start doing a whole heap of willy-nilly type of digital and other interventions until such time as this global standard is really clear and adopted by everybody. Because if they don't do it according to that or towards that, there may be some fruitless expenditure out there that, we all as an industry would like to avoid and cannot afford, of course.
Okay. Erik, we need to take a quick break here to hear from our sponsor, Metrojet of Hong Kong. We'll be right back after this.
We're going to have the crown jewels of Asia, and I promise you we're going to have the nicest and busiest business aviation hangar in the region.
And we're back. We're talking to Erik Kriel of Aurecon, and we were talking about airports earlier. I use the analogy airports are a bit like tanker ships. It takes a long time for them to change course simply because there's so much involved. It takes a decade to get a decent-sized airport up and running. You look at what they're doing in China and Beijing. Those take forever to get developed. Do you see airports changing now in terms of, are people going to be going out and building a lot more airports, or is there going to be a pause in construction and design and those kinds of things?
Yes, there will be a pause, and we already experienced that. There will definitely have to be a pause in terms of big capacity construction because there is no growth to respond to at the moment. So there's significant deferral in construction associated with capacity. But having said that, we know that airports are very infrastructure heavy, but they also, throughout aviation, we've got ample proof from the past that airports and aviation is very agile. So yes, infrastructure heavy, but not necessarily a big tanker ship. They can actually make decisions quite quickly and turn things around quite quickly. Again, if you reference the global financial crisis, 28, and again maybe 9/11 to in a similar vein. Big events, aviation had big damage, big quick impacts, but they equally responded quite quickly and came with innovative solutions to deal with those issues as a consequence. And not all of those solutions are infrastructural. They may be operational or administrative, things like that. So again, I think the speed of turnaround and the speed of response is not as related to the need to develop capacity, and that's in a way a simple argument to solve. But it's more around finding these divergent policies and adopting them into a single spot where people can respond to. And again, that's the regional context. If I take my own experience or our experience, I'm based in Australia. We've got a great health situation right now, but the national government does not have a direct health response. The primal health sits at state level. So we're sitting with the strange situation that, as a consequence, we've got international borders closed, national competency, but state borders are ebbing and flowing, opening and closing on a dare I say, a weekly basis, depending on the local outbreaks and such like. So that agility to respond to that is more operational than infrastructural. Airports have to deal with that, passengers have to deal with that. So that sort of volatility will probably be with us for a while until such time as standards emerge and get adopted and vaccines are effectively rolled out.
Yeah, my publisher's in Australia, and she complains about the border closures from time to time whenever I'm on a call with her. Yeah. You mentioned something in your last answer that for some reason it sparked the question for me, because when we talk about airports changing, the infrastructure and all of that, we've seen some moves recently from people like Airbus, other manufacturers, OEMs, where they're talking about hydrogen. And there was just an announcement from the Île-de-France airport authorities in Paris looking for, proof of concept or requests for proposals for hydrogen infrastructure. This is such a moonshot program to change the face of aviation to a zero emission aircraft. But I mean, just the amount of infrastructure involved to go to a hydrogen fuel. Is that something that you're looking at, that your company is looking at? Do you have research going on for that?
Yes, we're not traditionally a company that works on the airframe and engine manufacturing side, the flight side, but we're obviously heavily focused on the ground side, as it were, so airport development, runway, and things like that. And we are right now actively busy writing some thought pieces around this. Our focus, and we believe that should be the focus of many airports, is spotting the opportunities and the means to think about decarbonizing their energy consumption. That's a very meaningful thing that airports can do. We've, in our indicative research, our researchers indicatively told us that it doesn't again have to cost an arm and a leg. It's not only about social outcomes and environmental outcomes. It's probably something that airports would invariably have landed on for cost reasons. So there's an absolute myriad of options available to airports to get there. And right now we're working on try to modulate and say what would be meaningful things for airports to do right now. Because it's tech ready or facilities are in need of that, and what may be a more medium-term thing, so where technology still needs to mature over, let's say, the next 5 to 10 years and get to market. And then there's the moonshot things out there that I think as a consequence, one of the consequences of COVID is actually brought forward in time, so alternative flight technologies and things like that. So to me, it's one of the positives of the COVID world. It's sort of put the world into a new global perspective on what's important. And definitely I'm very personally excited by the fact that there's focus on this arena.
Okay. We're running close to our time limit here, but I've got a couple of other questions very quickly. IATA and others said traffic won't get back to normal until 2024. Things certainly don't look set to improve this year until at least the middle of the year or the end of the year, depending on vaccine rollouts and quarantine measures and all of that. When you talk to your clients, and is that what you're telling them, that it's going to be 2024 till we're, quote, back to normal or anything?
Well, again, there's regional variation here. The biggest drivers towards success are the ones you've mentioned: vaccination rollout and the efficacy of vaccination, passenger confidence. We've touched on that a little bit earlier. I'm more worried about the underlying economic demand. In other words, what may be the economic hurt that the country and the globe has seen as a consequence of that. And I think that's probably going to be the biggest factor here. But we also have to say this is a black swan event. We don't have empirical data to strengthen an outlook. So there's a lot of work out there and being done that says anything between the end of this year and 2024. But I do see international traffic starting to return significantly in the second half of this year, because I think those conditions are being slowly met. Standardization, protocols emerging, passenger confidence on the rise. Again, I can use an example from Australia. We've managed to, because it's a big country, so it's a continent country, so its domestic traffic in sort of sector length terms actually matches international. And we've had, over Christmas and New Year, despite these lockdowns that come and go, we've had fantastic rebounds in domestic traffic, for example. So there's clear evidence that people still want to travel and that there's economic demand for that travel. There's means to pay for it. And I think so. Therefore, if you take that analogy and you sort of transfer it to a global scenario, I'm pretty optimistic that it may turn out to be more soon than commonly accepted.
Well, in Australia too, you've got airlines like Rex that are actually sort of what's the old term? Never let a crisis go to waste, and they've sort of taken that on, and they're ordering jets and they're expanding. They're trying to compete with Qantas and Virgin Australia on the domestic market and all of that. So they're actually trying to expand during this time. So that's interesting. You mentioned also that there are different regional differences around the world. Do you think Asia Pacific countries here are better positioned to benefit from? I mean, you look at Singapore Airlines, Cathay Pacific, it's been horrible for them. Changi Airport, one of the, if not the best airport in the world, in my humble opinion, has just been decimated by all of this. Hong Kong for COVID plus political reasons and things. But is Asia Pacific better positioned to benefit from a rebound? Is the U.S. with its strong domestic market, or Europe? Tell us about the regional differences a little bit.
Again, I see a couple of factors at play there, which may not be equal across all countries. Definitely Singapore and Hong Kong are great examples of suffering from the affliction of geography. So they're islands, they don't have domestic traffic, big hub carriers, so they've been exceedingly hard, possibly a direct consequence of their geography. But then I can take the argument of geography and say that will have to benefit some other countries, such as Indonesia, for example. They're heavily reliant on aviation as a primary means of transportation across the country. So that's where geography works directly in their favor to reignite things and get things going again. Mentioned that a little bit earlier, the same argument applies to Australia. It's often because of the distance and the remoteness and low density of population, it's the only way or the essential way of moving people and goods. So geography is a big factor, and that differs, of course, across countries. I also think where Asia, and I'm talking about the bigger Asia-Pacific region, of course, is potentially at a better end of this, is structural issues. Who controls the facilities and how are they funded and such like. Is it a central control model or commercial model? I think there's a higher level of agility possibly in Asia-Pacific to respond to these issues. We've also observed socioeconomic variation. That's one that I'm a bit worried about. So some countries have got the wherewithal to roll out a vaccine much quicker and more effectively than others just through having the wealth or the systems in place to do so. And that may be where some of our friends and colleagues in Asia may struggle, and others will be absolutely front of the queue, like Singapore, as an example. But to me, the biggest thing that I think is positive for Asia Pacific is the culture. There's a culture of uptaking new tech real quickly and enabling it. To be nimble about these things, possibly to be a little bit used to them in some respects, if you take SARS and MERS and things like that. And also maybe a different national level of discipline, responding to national guidelines and requirements and such like. So I'm optimistic that Asia Pacific is in a very good position to get on with this and improve and probably beat many regions in the rest of the world at it.
Well, you kind of jumped ahead to my last question, and we're running out of time, so I want to do this. But you mentioned a couple of bright spots, the hydrogen, the zero carbon emission or decarbonization of airports. You talked about APAC being pretty well positioned to deal with any comeback. Is there any particular bright spot that appeals to you that we can look forward to for aviation this coming year?
Well, I'm really personally chuffed to see that the passenger or the user of the airport has been put first again. So the journey and the designs and the operational interventions are again putting the passenger first. So I think that's a massive plus point coming out of all of this. So a user-centered approach in the response is a fantastic outcome I see. I also think it will drive this journey management of having a contactless travel, having biometric information freely and securely shared, and all the things that go with that. That was talked about before COVID, but that's now been put front and center of everything. I think that's a fantastic outcome to accelerate that. Probably the one that I'm on a personal level most excited about is we've seen already in the Australian domestic market and others that there's a significant competition between airlines as they start reigniting travel and opening up things. So if nothing else, we're seeing lowered fares. So we've had some fantastic specials and deals that we can exercise. And I think that will probably be one of the plus points of this year. There will be a significant level of competition between airlines and therefore quite a significantly attractive fare offered to the passenger.
Great. Erik Kriel, Aviation Director for Planning and Strategy at Aurecon. Thanks for joining me in conversation.
Thank you very much.